Hi, this is Hannu TheHande Mäkinen, and welcome back to the history of video games part 2. And today we will actually start with the birth of the video game industry. And I let you off with a little question last time at the end of the last video. What was the first video game? Now, if you guessed Pong, well, you're in the right ballpark, so to speak, but you're not exactly right. Like I said last time, video game as a concept actually comprises of three major parts, which are console games, computer games, and arcade games, and in fact, the very first video game was a computer game. Like I said before, the history of computer games actually goes back to the 1950s, and in fact, the first video game that we know of was a computer game. It was a tic-tac-toe game made in the 1950s called XOX, and this is a very obscure game. Most people probably have never heard of it, but that is the earliest example of somebody making a game on a computer that people could play. The most commonly recognized first video game is called Tennis for Two, which was made on an oscillator in the late 60s. Now, this was something that you really couldn't play. It was put in a museum on display, basically to show off like how clever the creators were, that they were able to make this tennis game. And the way it works was that it actually had two players on each side of the field, and the ball actually had its own sort of self-generated gravity, so it was actually a very advanced kind of tennis game for 1960. Then, of course, there is the issue of Space Wars. Space Wars, most people have played this game. You've probably heard of it. You might be surprised that it is as old as it is. It was actually written back in the 1960s, and by written I mean in code, and was distributed as an open source game in the computer technologies departments of American universities in the late 60s and early 70s. And you could, basically, you could play this game if you were a computer student back then on a compact computer, and compact meaning that it was a computer the size of a refrigerator. But basically, this was one of the first times that a number of people would play a game on computers. The thing that's common with these very early examples, however, you will notice that none of them were really open to the general public, not even Space Wars, which was eventually turned into an arcade game on its own, but they were also all multiplayer games, so there wasn't such a thing as artificial intelligence that did not exist at this point. Video games were designed to be played by multiple people. Now, the first commercially released video game system, however, was the Magnavox Odyssey, which some of you may have heard if you watched Angry Video Game Nerd or read it from other sources like I have. But basically, it came out in 1971, developed by the Magnavox Television Company. It was sort of similar to Pong, except it didn't have a score or sound or any kind of structure to speak of. It actually came with a bunch of different stuff that you needed in order to play games on it, so it was barely programmed. The lesson that you're going to learn on this course is just because you're first doesn't make you the best. Atari obviously did look at the Magnavox Odyssey and think, maybe we could make some money off of this, but Atari was a little bit more smart. They initially released Pong, which of course became one of their best-selling products of all time, as an arcade cabinet. So when you have an arcade cabinet, you make instant profit off of every single coin that people put in it. So basically, Atari saw that people liked playing that kind of a game, and also the Atari Pong had a few advantages, like the fact that it was an actual game. So it was no surprise why Atari then released a home version of the Pong console, and really this started the first generation of video game consoles. We can always say, usually, that the generation starts when at least two consoles are out. And what followed, of course, was then tons of different companies came out with their own Pong clones, and yes, these were all literally just the same Pong game over and over and over again. I mean, some had color as opposed to the original Pong, which was in black and white. some had alternate game modes, but basically we have basically an entire business created out of a single product. But it also proves another important point about the history of video games is that when something is popular, you keep copying it over and over and over again. But that then really begs the question, is this really an era of computer gaming, or were these just the baby steps of what would eventually become the video game industry? Oh wait, we have multiple companies making systems and making profit out of it in a very specified consumer base. You know what? I would call that a video game market. I mean, yes, it was very geographically limited. We're talking mostly about the United States, maybe some European countries, but the only country besides the United States and maybe Canada that we can confirm that Pong was really spreading to was actually Japan, because in the mid-70s the Magnavox Odyssey actually landed in Japan, and it was being imported by a company which at this time was still sort of flirting with the idea of entering the video game business, but which would eventually become a pretty big deal. But with an entire market filled with nothing but Pong clones, you might wonder how exactly could a market like this sustain itself, and of course quite literally it couldn't. What happened eventually in 1977, a piece of hardware appeared which made all Pong consoles instantly obsolete. And that, of course, was the Atari 2600. This is one of the things that I do like about the first console generation, is that, okay, so there wasn't a lot of games, so to speak, that we could talk about. In the arcades in the late 70s, especially thanks to companies like Taito, who made Space Invaders, the industry got out of the mentality that every single game had to be a ball bouncing back and forth. But it's also nice because we can draw a definite beginning and an end to when this console generation started and when it ended. We can literally talk about the Pong era coming to an end in 1977 because every single company that had made a Pong machine at that point completely bowed out, because Atari's 2600 was just a completely in a class of its own as a video game system. And we'll see later why we can't really draw those kinds of exact lines for most other console generations, because there is quite a considerable amount of overlapping. And although most of the console manufacturers in the first generation didn't really transcend into the second generation, there were a few that were in it for the long run. Atari, obviously. The other one was, surprisingly enough, Magnavox, and I'm gonna have to talk about Magnavox now because they're not gonna come up anytime soon later, is that Magnavox, of course, even though their Odyssey machine couldn't really compete with the popularity of the Pong, they were in this for the long run, and I do have to congratulate them, but I do also have to question the reasoning for releasing their second console, which was the Odyssey 2. Which, although a console, was also designed to be a home computer. Yes, home computers finally coming into this whole thing, and of course the late 70s was also when the computer gaming scene was finally starting to flourish. But unfortunately the Odyssey 2 illustrates a second important point that you're gonna learn as this course goes on, that until really the sixth console generation, any console that tries to be like a computer spells instant disaster, and that's really what was happening with the Odyssey 2. It tried to compete with the Atari 2600, but it was really poor at that. Atari, conversely, went on to almost instant success, in fact, crazy success that we're going to look at, and we're also going to see the seeds of Atari's inevitable undoing. So my question for next time, how can you go bankrupt if you're the best-selling console manufacturer of your generation? See you on the next one. So, my question for next time, is Donkey Kong a monkey or a donkey?